Decades later, he's standing in a studio with a tape rolling, and the entire genre has already decided who he was. Which is the cruelest kind of rediscovery, because nobody asks the man in the room what he became in the years nobody was listening.
The Lomax cuts, those Library of Congress field recordings from the 40s, where a folklorist showed up with a microphone to catch the music before it disappeared, are him working, not him remembering what working was.
And that's okay so. House cut records back in 1930, then basically vanished from the music world for over 30 years. And those three guys find him in Rochester in '64 and he's just there. He's been there. And I think what gets lost is that for House it wasn't a rescue, it was a reckoning. Like they showed up assuming he'd been erased and he'd actually just been living. And I need to sit with that difference because the folk revival story we tell is about saving something dead, and what if the thing wasn't dead? What if it was just not wanted, which is maybe worse? And then suddenly it's wanted again, and you're supposed to feel grateful for it. And I don't know if I believe he got to feel anything but tired about the whole thing.
The collectors weren't rescuing blues men. They were assembling a particular version of American soul for the folk revival, the mid-60s movement where white college audiences rediscovered older black musicians and made their music commercial again. And the version they needed was old, delta-rooted, and willing to sit still for documentation. Skip James and Mississippi John Hurt. Other pre-war blues musicians rediscovered by that same revival circuit. And House all fit that shape, but the shape itself was doing the selecting, not the other way around.
Okay, so, I know that's the story everybody wants, but Johnson showing up in Robinsonville to watch House play, that's not myth. That's a kid recognizing something in a man that he needed to be, and House saw him and kept playing anyway. And that's mentorship, y'all. That's the real blood in the story. And I need us to sit with that before we let the devil take all the air in the room.
He told it the way the legend runs. That Johnson disappeared for a stretch and came back playing like a man who traded something for it at a midnight crossroads. Because it explained something he needed explained. Johnson's transformation was real. It happened in front of him, and the only language available was the one that made it mythic. Which doesn't make the myth true, but it does make it his problem too, not just ours. He didn't invent the crossroads, he just couldn't think his way out of it any faster than we could.
Y'all, that's the thing. It's not like he's using the church as a symbol for something else, right? He's standing in both rooms at the same time, and you can hear him deciding which one he's in with every single line, and then the next line he's in the other one. I don't think he ever actually picked a room. That split just lived in his throat.
Question is whether he'd forgotten them or just hadn't played them in 30 years. Not the same thing. By most accounts, Alan Wilson, the young musician who coached him ahead of the Columbia sessions, walked House back through his own slide parts. That gliding bottleneck style, the guitar played like a second voice, which reads as either generous or a red flag, depending on whether you trust the work or the Lomax tapes, where House needed no coaching at all.
Jack White's on record saying that track, just a voice and hand claps, was the template for everything the White Stripes stripped away to get to. White's right that it's a template, but he's also doing what we all do with our origin stories, working backward from what he needed to hear and calling it what he found. The song wasn't built from almost nothing. It was built from everything House had already lived, compressed so tight there's no room for decoration. That's not minimalism. That's density. What Jack inherited wasn't the absence. He inherited the permission structure, which is a different genealogy entirely. And it matters because one of those lineages leads to rigor and the other leads to aesthetic purity, and they sound nothing alike once you're actually inside the work.
When there's nothing else, the hands give you everything. Timing, pressure, the shape of the pause between hits. You can't fake that. On a record like this one, you hear the hands before you hear the voice.
And I kept waiting for the guitar to come in, y'all. Like my brain was still looking for it even after the song had already answered me. And then I realized it was done. It was complete without it, and that hit different. Like I'd been holding my breath and didn't know it.
We score three things separately on this show: the physical pressing, the performance, and its reach forward into what it influenced. And right here is where the first two start to pull apart. The Lomax cuts let the voice sit in the room. Columbia's got it compressed tight. That squeezing the gap between the quietest and loudest moments, gained it up, pulled the peaks down. You can hear where they decided it needed to sound like a record instead of a man standing there. Question is what you lose when you make it safe for the living room.
They're selling his testimony to an audience that wasn't there. A white revival that needed him to be exactly what he was, which means they needed him to stay exactly what he'd been. That's a very specific kind of preservation and a very specific kind of cage. The cage has bars made of vinyl that never went out of print. So we're allowed to notice both things at once: that the transaction was real and the staying power was real, and neither one erases the other.
Y'all, but he's singing. That's not a circumstance, that's a choice. He walked into that studio and he sang, and whatever Columbia wanted from him, whatever the folk revival audience wanted, Sun House wanted something too, and I need to know what he got. The transaction's real, fine. I'm not denying the transaction. But if we make the industries wanting the whole story, we're doing the same thing twice. We're saying what white people needed matters more than what he decided to do with his voice. And I won't spend the whole conversation there when the voice is right here.
Whatever it was in '65, the racks don't lie. Columbia's kept it in print, and the labels after them kept it in print, and it's still there 60 years on. That's not appetite, that's a steady order that never got cancelled. You can argue what the transaction meant. You can't argue it stopped.
The repressing is proof of appetite, not absolution. It just means the appetite's been reliable enough to feed continuously, which is precisely the opposite of what we're after. The transaction doesn't close, it compounds. Every new addition is another moment the industry gets to decide who Sun House is for. And every time they decide it's worth money, they're not wrong about the music. They're just profitable about it, which are different things.
The record's done 100 things for 100 people. 93, I'll grant you that. But the pressing itself, the actual object in your hand, it's been compressed and processed for living rooms that don't exist anymore. The Lomax acetates are louder. They're wilder. This one sounds like 1965 decided what 1930 should sound like, and I'm scoring what's actually there, not what it meant.
Okay, wait. And I'm not saying he's wrong about the grooves. I'm saying the grooves aren't the point here. If they were, he could just read the spec sheet. The voice is doing something the equipment can't touch. It's doing it through the equipment, yeah, but the equipment's job is to get out of the way, and I don't think it did. That's a real problem. But docking him for compression when the thing that's still moving people, 60 years later, that voice cutting through everything, including the compression. That feels like measuring a man's height while he's standing in a hole, and then saying he's shorter than you thought.
The Lomax cuts sit in that room still. You can hear the air moving. That Columbia session, they've wound it down 3 turns and sent it back through the desk. The voice is the same. The problem's not the voice.
Wait. No, actually, let me recalibrate. The Lomax cuts are the baseline. The Columbia pressing is compressed against that baseline, which means I've been crediting rawness to a record that attenuated it. I scored the distinctiveness wrong on that axis. That's a real problem, and it's his.
Okay, wait, but those Lomax cuts are him remembering, and this record is him choosing. That's not the same thing as wrong mastering. That's 2 different decisions about what gets kept and what gets left behind. And I need both of them to exist because one without the other tells a lie about what he actually was, and I'm not ready to let that go.
The mastering and the object are both true, which means the album's caught between two jobs it can't do simultaneously. It's trying to document testimony and cell intimacy at the same time, and you can hear where those ambitions collide inside the grooves, where the production pulls toward one and the material tugs toward the other. That's not a flaw in the engineering. That's the actual problem with asking a voice, shaped by 1941 to speak through a 1965 machine and do both things at once.
He's right about the objects. But Wilson's sitting in to help House remember his own slides. That's shaping too, isn't it? Your hands do what they do to the grooves, and intention doesn't alter the groove.
I say the real thing. You called it foundational 7 times and canonical twice, but nobody said what it costs to have been Sun House in 1941 and still need rediscovering in 1964.
The masterings never settled. 40-odd years of represses and nobodies got the low mids right yet. That's not a problem with the record. That's the record still asking the machine to do something it hasn't figured out how to do.
The root system, not the tree. Delta blues stripped to bone. Slide guitar as confession, voice as open wound. The grain of a man who lived the decades between obscurity and rediscovery and brought every one of them into the room. Grin in your face, hand claps and nothing else. The most honest production decision on the record, because there was no decision. Just what remained when everything was refused. Influence this deep stops being influence. Becomes geology. 92.
Y'all, that's exactly it. He's scoring how clean the grooves can get, and I'm scoring a man who walked into a room knowing he'd never be clean again. And those two things don't reconcile because they're not supposed to. The preacher part of him and the bluesman part of him are still arguing in real time, and that argument is the record, not a flaw in the record.
The transmission is the point, isn't it? Not that he made it beautiful, but that he made it possible, made it legible as a choice rather than a limitation. And then everyone after him got to inherit the permission. Jack White didn't learn minimalism from a theorist. He learned it from grooves that refused to apologize for what they weren't. That's influence operating at the root level, where it stops being a thing you can measure and starts being a thing you breathe.
Same 3 axes, pulled apart more than usual. 70 for the pressing, 91 for the record itself, 93 for what it set in motion. The ripple, meaning its reach forward into everything it influenced. That's not a contradiction. The record changed everything that came after it. Doesn't mean the take itself had headroom.
And they didn't have to wonder if he was dead or make it romantic. They found him and he was there and he could make the record. That's what matters to me, y'all. Not that we got to hear him, but that he got to make it, that he was alive enough to do it. And somebody brought the equipment and asked, and he said yes.
The question was who this record was built for, and I'm not going to solve that now. But I'll say this. Whatever audience it was supposed to find, whatever the chess was, the record itself refused to be that small. It lived beyond the strategy. 60 years of living is the only verdict that matters.
Y'all, a voice and 2 hands clapping. That's the whole thing, and it still moves people 60 years later. And I don't know if that's preservation or if that's just what happens when you make something true enough that it refuses to stop mattering. So maybe the question isn't whether we're keeping it alive, but whether we ever get to stop asking it to stay.